A reading from the first letter of John, chapter 4. Beloved, let us love one another, because love is from God. Everyone who loves is born of God and knows God. Whoever does not love does not know God, for God is love. God's love was revealed to us in this way. God sent God's only child into the world so that we might live through that child. God is love, and those who abide in love abide in God, and God abides in them. Love has been perfected among us in this, that we may have boldness on the day of judgment, because as God is, so are we in this world. There is no fear in love, but perfect love casts out fear. For fear has to do with punishment, and whoever fears has not reached perfection in love. We love because God first loved us. Those who say, I love God, and hate their brothers and sisters are liars. For those who do not love a brother or sister whom they have seen cannot love God whom they have not seen. The word of God for the people of God.
Thanks be to God.
Once a year, I have to write my annual report. It is included in the whole packet of annual reports that gets distributed to the congregation prior to the annual meeting. I often look back at my report from the previous year to jumpstart my writing. Here is the opening paragraph from my report 1 year ago. My extended family and friends often ask me how I, as a pastor, navigate such turbulent times with you, my congregation. And I answer this way. The church cannot avoid painful realities, nor can it be consumed by them. Sometimes the church must name hard truths and actively resist the hate, lies, violence, and corruption. Other times the church must be a place of refuge, offering comfort, safety, rest, hope, and delight as an antidote to the pain of the wider culture. And my job is to make sure I do both. For the past 2 Sundays, when we observed the starlight of Epiphany and the baptism of Christ, I designed our worship services to be on the comfort, hope, and delight side of things. This morning, I'm going to move into a place of turbulence and name a hard truth. Israel and Palestine. They've been engaged in the brutality of war for 107 days. Since the violence perpetrated by Hamas on Jewish settlements in Israel on October 7th, this new iteration of an old conflict has been a daily reality. Thousands of people have been killed, maimed, injured, displaced. Thousands of people are bereft and furious. The history of conflict in that region of the world is extraordinarily complex. It's about land, it's about religion, it's about violence, it's about generational trauma, it's about mistrust and racism and retribution and so much more. So who am I, with only a layperson's understanding of all that Arab-Israeli history, who am I to dissect and critique any of it? I'm going to leave that to the scholars to do. But what I'm going to do for the rest of this sermon is this. I'll offer 2 reflections of my own, and then turn to someone else's theological reflection. So here it goes. My first comment is this. Anti-Semitism, which is hostility to, prejudice toward, or discrimination against Jewish people, it's real. It's been the lived experience for Jews for thousands of years. We live in a world that is deeply suspicious of Jewish people, and anti-Semitism is the manifestation of that fear. Anti-Semitism is expressed in small ways, one person at a time, and also in systemic ways through countries, governments, and armed conflict. Anti-Semitism is real, and it is ugly, ugly, ugly. At the same time, being critical of Israel, or being critical of the United States' relationship with Israel, ought not be confused with being anti-Semitic. I'm going to say that one again. Being critical of Israel or being critical of the U.S.'s relationship with Israel ought not be confused with being anti-Semitic. We must not conflate the two. Here in the U.S., some people have criticized Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, his military response to the October 7th massacre. Others have criticized the lapse in Israeli security that allowed the massacre to happen in the first place. College and university students have protested. Journalists have written harsh critiques. Diplomats and other government officials have tried to thread a very tiny needle of support for Israel while acknowledging the bloodshed on both sides. Speaking out against this current war and how it is unfolding, being critical of Israel or the Palestinians does not necessarily mean someone is anti-Semitic or anti-Palestinian. We must have a more nuanced understanding. So that was my first thing. Here's my second comment. Violence begets violence. I know, not an original thought. I also know that violence is part of the human condition. I know that Christians have perpetrated violence throughout the ages in the name of Christianity. I know that Jesus was tortured, nailed to a cross, and died a violent death. You know all of that too. Still, the fact that violence begets violence needs to be said aloud in the context of worship. Hamas and Israel have both perpetrated violence. And likewise, Palestinians and Israelis, soldiers, terrorist fighters, civilians, they have all suffered unspeakably because of violence, arguing over who has suffered more than whom. That's a fool's errand. And now here's the hard part. I admit that if I were a Jew in Israel, or if I were a Palestinian in Gaza, I might be in favor of violence to protect my children, my family, my home, my community. I might be in favor of violence to retaliate against those who harmed or destroyed my children, my family, my home, my community. I might even resort to inflicting violence on an enemy myself. We can say, oh, I would never do that. I would not succumb. But who knows? We have not endured what they have endured. We are not living their reality. So if you think you would never resort to such violence, I'd ask you to think again. As followers of the way of Jesus, who was the embodiment of divine love, compassion, and peace, we must grapple with this tension. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., he grappled with this tension. He grappled with it mightily, like the Old Testament prophets did. I now turn to his wisdom, his theology, his oratory. This past week, I read the full transcript of MLK's speech called Beyond Vietnam, A Time to Break Silence. He delivered the speech at the Riverside Church in Manhattan on April 4th, 1967, and he would be assassinated exactly 1 year later on April 4th, 1968. If you want to listen to an audio recording of King giving this speech, get comfortable because it clocks in at 56 minutes. I'm going to read several excerpts of his speech, but in the place of the word Vietnam, I'm going to use Israel or Palestine. Remember that by speaking against the war in Vietnam, King was really stepping out of his civil rights lane, and many people did not like it. Now, obviously, the Vietnam War and the war in Israel-Palestine are markedly different, but King's theology is big enough to speak to both conflicts, then and now. Finally, a word about language. I am preserving King's language for God and humanity, which is gendered as masculine. So, listen now to the words of the prophet MLK. As I have moved to break the betrayal of my own silences and to speak from the burnings of my own heart, as I have called for radical departures from the destruction of Israel-Palestine, many persons have questioned me about the wisdom of my path. Why are you speaking about the war, Dr. King? Why are you joining the voices of dissent? Peace and civil rights do not mix, they say. Aren't you hurting the cause of your people, they ask. And when I hear them, though I often understand the sources of their concerns, I am nevertheless greatly saddened, for such questions mean that the inquirers have not really known me, my commitment, or my calling. I have to live with the meaning of my commitment to the ministry of Jesus Christ. To me, the relationship of this ministry to the making of peace is so obvious that I sometimes marvel at those who would ask why I am speaking against the war. Could it be that they do not know that the good news was meant for all men, for communist and capitalist, for their children and ours, for black, for white, for revolutionary and conservative? Have they forgotten that my ministry is in obedience to the one who loved his enemies so fully that he died for them? What then can I say to Hamas or Netanyahu as a faithful minister of this one? I must be true to my conviction that I share with all men the calling to be a son of the living God. Beyond the calling of race or nation or creed is this vocation of sonship and brotherhood. Because I believe that God is deeply concerned for his suffering and helpless and outcast children, I come tonight to speak for them. This I believe to be the privilege and the burden of all of us who deem ourselves bound by allegiances and loyalties, which are broader and deeper than nationalism. We are called to speak for the weak, for the voiceless, for the victims of our nation, for those it calls enemy, for no document from human hands can make these humans any less our brothers. Here is the true meaning and value of compassion and nonviolence, when it helps us to see the enemy's point of view, to hear his questions, to know his assessment of ourselves. For from his view, we may indeed see the basic weaknesses of our own condition, and if we are mature, we may learn and grow and profit from the wisdom of the brothers who are called the opposition. Somehow this madness must cease. A true revolution of values will soon cause us to question the fairness and justice of many of our past and present policies. On the one hand, we are called to play the Good Samaritan on life's roadside, but that will only be an initial act. One day we must come to see that the whole Jericho road must be transformed, so that the men and women will not be beaten and robbed as they make their journey on life's highway. A true revolution of values will soon look uneasily on the glaring contrast of poverty and wealth. A true revolution of values will lay hands on the world order and say of war, "This way of settling differences is not just." A nation that continues year after year to spend more money on military defense than on programs of social uplift is approaching spiritual death. A genuine revolution of values means, in the final analysis, that our loyalties must become ecumenical rather than sectional. Every nation must now develop an overriding loyalty to mankind as a whole in order to preserve the best in their individual societies. This call for a worldwide fellowship that lifts neighborly concern beyond one's tribe, race, class, and nation is a call for an all-embracing and unconditional love for all of mankind. Now, when I speak of love, I am not speaking of some sentimental and weak response. I'm not speaking of that force which is just emotional bosh. I am speaking of that force which all of the great religions have seen as the supreme unifying principle of life. This reality is beautifully summed up in the first epistle of St. John, chapter 4. Let us love one another, for love is God. And every one that loveth is born of God and knoweth God. He that loveth not knoweth not God, for God is love. We still have a choice, King says: non-violent coexistence or violent co-annihilation. Non-violent coexistence or violent co-annihilation. Now let us begin. Now let us rededicate ourselves to the long and bitter but beautiful struggle for a new world. Shall we say the odds are too great? Shall we tell them the struggle is too hard? If we will make the right choice, we will be able to transform this pending cosmic elegy into a creative psalm of peace. If we will make the right choice, we will be able to transform the jangling discords of our world into a beautiful symphony of brotherhood. If we will but make the right choice, we will be able to speed up the day all over America and all over the world, when justice will roll down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. Thanks be to God for the words, the eloquence, the theological vision of Martin Luther King. I close with this. A few weeks ago, I heard an interview on Minnesota Public Radio. The host was talking with two men who live in Gaza, one Jewish, one Palestinian. Toward the end of the interview, each man finally laid bare their truths. The Jewish man said, "We feel alone." And the Palestinian man said, "We feel disposable." When feeling alone and feeling disposable are at the root of the conflict, weapons and violence are not the answer. There is only one answer, and the answer is love. Amen.